Okay. Oh. Alrighty. Welcome. Wednesday office hours. We're going to look at, we're continuing our sort of look at Fred Moseley. We'll begin with, we'll start his book on totality soon. But I think we sort of need to get a few other things sort of straightened out before we start looking at Moseley's sort of masterwork on totality. Oh. And so, to that end, um, there are bunches of articles on Moseley, certainly, and on Melt, which we'll talk about in a second. It's just important that we acknowledge that there's um, sets of ideas that are both good and bad that come with that. What the original Moseley article is long and complicated, and but sort of necessary, I suppose. So another article by Potts that is actually a one that we might look at as well. But I figured that we would look at a short Moseley article before we sort of get through this. Now, Moseley identifies a kind of circular reasoning in the new interpretation and the so-called temporal single system interpretation. Now, these interpretations are important because they revive certain sets of ideas about Marx as and capital in the post-war period, and they represent a variety of thinking. And on the one hand, they compete. On the other hand, you sort of have to see all of them as a piece of this larger question of value and price. How is it that we can have something called value? How is it that it can be measured? Can it be measured? Should it be measured? And what's the role of price and value in this particular context? So the point, of course, is to figure out what kinds of things support the notion of a labor theory of value, understanding clearly, as we've been looking before, that you don't have to um, take it as gospel. In fact, taking it as gospel is kind of problematic in and of itself. You have to sort of be open, as opposed to closed, to a set of ideas, a kind of logic, a logic that is more open to the idea that you can actually oppose what is currently the kind of dominant set of views. Now, Moseley doesn't serve that purpose necessarily, but it's just important to articulate all these differences. So note that we were looking before at Anwar Sheikh's work, identifying that, and the important point to get from that, of course, is that he's addressing classical political economy. He hasn't abandoned Marx. In fact, he's placed Marx, as many do and have done uh, in the prior decades, placing Marx among and because he is among the classical political economists, Smith, Ricardo et al. And the important point is to be able to situate classical political economy not simply as something that we should revive again, so much as there was a moment, and it was an important moment when marginal analysis, a marginal revolution occurs, and it's a lot easier to calculate, to make kinds of judgments about economies in a slightly more orderly way, one that could be more rendered mathematical. But it is, and just like even in the Moseley example here, um, you make certain assumptions about how it's supposed to go. It is those are the constraints on which you're sort of working through the problem, and it is important to consider that you do need to have the entire context of all of these things sort of working against each other. They are in fact contingent on each other in that sense. So the continued interest, of course, is Marx, and in Marx is the idea that there was something called actually existing socialism, that it wasn't perhaps the best example of it. In fact, one of perhaps the most problematic version of it. But that doesn't mean that we have to sort of accept all of the issues with it. And yes, of course, there are tremendous problems that occurred during it, but I don't think they're any different than the other kinds of historical problems that come with the story. And so, in all of these cases, we want to be able to situate this argument, this set of arguments, as a kind of, not the argument, but it's a fundamental condition under which we have to sort of discuss things, and to fit this set of ideas, that is, some sort of materialism, some sort of historical materialism, and to see it as having clear continuity relative to the 20th century, and that in the 21st century we still have versions of and different ways to look at historical materialism. So this all fits together, and it not that it's a good fit, but that there's certain concepts that we sort of would like to bring forward, because you have to ultimately we have to fit this into reality, or to compare it to reality, or measure reality with it. So there's all those elements that are part of the problem. Okay, so this article is by Fred Moseley, the MELT, the MELT, and Circular Reasoning in the New Interpretation of the Temporal Single System Interpretation, TSSI. So there will be, acronyms and other stuff, and hopefully you'll be able to follow this. Certainly when you read it. And as I said, there's a couple of other articles, an article by Potts, a bunch of other, the Potts article I may throw in here eventually. The point in this particular instance is that I wanted to show Moseley himself in terms of a single article, and to indicate that these are the kind of the stakes against which, or with which, we build a reasonable historical materialist approach that can serve as a kind of analytic model, or sets of models, in order to develop a variety that fits in and is allowed to critique certain research programs. So while this may seem a little fundamentalist, it is not completely, without interest, and it still is kind of current in sort of thinking about some of the key elements, and understanding that when we talk about these things, we don't get too tied up with what has been a certain sort of a fixity or commitment to certain ideas, and a whole set of other attachments meant we can talk about that history. That's a fine history. But ultimately, we still want to get to the political economy points, and that is that there is something that is alienating. There is something that is motivated by, probably the worst elements of sort of the human condition. And we can see that there are costs to all this. Ultimately, the kind of uh, the destruction of the planet and all of those other things. And it's pretty clear that that some people are operate in contradistinction to it, and they are willing to destroy the planet for simply because they have subjective reasons for, um, and we could call that greed. We could call it a bunch of other things. Sort of universal bad faith in that sense. But ultimately, we have to get back to the idea that, assuming that there is an Anthropocene, um, and without discussing the notion of a Capitalocene, which is somewhat needless in some ways because it is an abstraction. It is clearly the moment that we've seen that self-destruction kind of built into it, and that's kind of the critique of capitalism that comes in with this. And what we're looking at is building the tools to for an anti-capitalist discourse. So, okay, I barely got through the first couple of sentences. Let me say that at the end, towards the end of this little page, there is uh, a little YouTube piece on the fundamentals of Marx, and more specifically, a discussion of the labor theory of value. So let me go to this chart first before we go into the Moseley, because this is a way of talking about MELT. Now, it's a 10-minute video, so you should watch it at your leisure. The point being is that there are some key elements that are common to most discourses of a political economy type, and there are things that seem somewhat familiar, right? There's money. There is the thing that front ends volume one of Capital, and that is commodity. In two ways, they commodity as a natural thing, as raw materials, etc., and then, of course, the produced commodity, which is a transformation of nature, raw materials, into something person made, something manufactured. So this is the process, and Marx decides, and importantly, to sort of get all this other stuff out of the way, to talk about some very simple ideas, and they're very simple ideas that have problematic representations, and of course get very complicated. As the for example, the financialization discourse goes. But you can see this going on, right? That there is a kind of circuit. Money is involved, profit is generated. That is money plus some incremental increase in money, and that's built in. It's built into a capitalist system, a system driven by capital relations, as opposed to non-capital or anti-capital, pre-capital relations. So we have to deal with what we have, and what we have is we're in the mode of production called capitalism. At some moment, and there could be socialism, a real socialism, as opposed to an actually existing attempt at socialism, which you could say that the Soviet and um, Chinese versions of this are as good as it gets. But as you can see, in both instances, and in problematic ways, they've become sort of proto-capitalist. There is no actually existing socialism. There are these variations, some good, some bad, some open, some closed, etc. So this is the basic circuit, right? Money, commodity, production, produce commodity. And once you get to the produced commodity and this idea that it represents money and that it creates, a circuit of consumption, etc. So what you see here is the sort of front end, Department 1, that is the production of things, and you haven't gotten to Department 2 yet, but you need Department 2. Department 2 is there because you don't make, you're making commodities for, consumption of some kind. It's just that Marx focused on the productive for a variety of reasons, and that's why there is a labor theory of value, because it makes uh, political elements identifiable as, labor struggles or class struggle are built on these differences. And Marx spells it out kind of easy, and it shouldn't be difficult. And in fact, it's clearer than some of the other attempts to try and make describing capitalism in a coherent way. And I hope, and we'll probably look at some of those critiques subsequently. And anyway, profit is built into the notion of the system, and you can see the acronyms that come with this. So there's money, M, commodity, C, production, P, produced commodity, which is C prime, and because of everything that comes after we start making stuff, you get M prime, that is money plus profit. And this whole mechanism is, a feature of this thing called capitalism, because it requires certain elements that, we find just sort of conventional, but doesn't have to be that way. Human relations does not have to be measured by money, even though there are people out there who are totally driven by this kind of abstraction, and to the detriment of humanity, which is ultimately what the problem is, or how problems are created. So, needless to say, this is a slide from that 10-minute little thing, a video, and it describes, the basic ideas of specific versus universal, the qualitatively different from the quantitatively different, and those differences are important because they represent the difference between subject or subjectivity and objectivity. And note, of course, that this is a dialectic relation, and that labor is described within this process. And as you've been following along from the beginning, there is a difference between labor itself and something that is an abstraction from or of labor, and that being, the difference between labor and labor power, the difference between labor power, labor, and wage. All of those things are there, and they do describe something quite, in each instance, quite different, and it should not be problematic to conceive, because it's just that Marx puts them in a particular set of relations and identifies the fact that, we live in a material world. Humans are important to this material world, and all of the relationships that exist as a function of this are part of trying to tell, as David Harvey does, the story of capital. It is a story. It is not, it's only one set of narratives that kind of construct that. So, that being said, we note, of course, that both things, concrete labor and abstract labor, have some other elements in it, and that includes time. And they are cumulative, and the idea of the commodity is important because commodities are the way in which we can think about value. Things become valorized in that particular context, and that this should be not controversial, that things like constant and variable and other kinds of things are part of this whole story. So we have our standard CS and V, and the difference, of course, being something that is more constant as opposed to something more variable and something that generates surplus. And so there is a net product that comes that will be described in the little video. And there's ways in which we can talk about these kinds of things. And one way of talking about it is the idea that there is a aggregated price. Now, even that is problematic because it is an abstraction to assume that in an industry or in a global context that you can talk about these sort of large scale things. It's only, as I will refer to in subsequent writing, is that it's a kind of indexical thing, that it's not a thing in itself. It is an index of something. And so price is that element, and then quantity is the other side of that. It is the thing itself. I mean, it is some closer representation. There is the product itself. There is the system of representations that are given to it by having all of this kind of motion go on. That is, you have a market, you have exchange, values, become problematized in that way. So anyway, so I'm just showing the slides of this. And so melt and just because we're going to get there, Moseley context is the monetary expression of uh, uh, of labor time, and it is aggregate price times or against or whatever net product divided by total socially necessary labor. So that's how you get to a monetary expression. And I think it's important to remember that because it connects all of these things together. And even though it's not mentioned here, all of this is part of how a commodity is formed. Now, we have this sense that a commodity can be reified in the sense of, pork bellies or whatever, but that's not really the story. The story is that there's this concept called commodity that connects all these things together, and that functions relative to the thing we might call a market. Now, and in a reified way, you can talk about it, it's the agora, blah, 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 as in marketplace, but it's not about places. It is about this other thing, the whole set of interchanges and all of its representations, which is really where the political economy question is you have a system of relations there's a political economy of these things in terms of the things themselves, and how they are represented as values. So a subsequent yak will be about that. Now, the video tries to sort of get this to work out, and this is where we always have problems reading Marx and Capital, etc., because of you try and get it to look more numerical, and it's fine. It's just that when you start trying to think about like gold and socially necessary labor time and paper money, dollars, it gets a little weird. But you can say that you can attach dollar amounts to socially necessary labor time. Now, the socially necessary labor time is a sort of uh, well, it's a burdensome concept, let's put it that way. But it's important because it identifies that it is human, that it sits at a um, it's not voluntary. It is part of necessity. It is beyond sufficiency. It is, or beneath sufficiency, um, in the sense that, you know, these are ways in which you can talk about it as a whole. And so don't get too tied up in the numbers. Even this basic set of numbers becomes problematic where you say, well, 1 ounce of gold equals 1 hour of socially necessary labor time. And you know that's what Marx is talking about in volume 1 of Capital. And how you begin to talk about it, whether it's pounds or dollars or whatever, and you begin to see that there is some set of relationships between labor time, not the labor itself. Remember, this is this idea that labor time is sort of a way in which you can more palpably abstract the process of labor. It's a way in which you and it's done for particular reasons. I mean, Marx does it because he wants to be able to explain to trade unionists, that this is one thing that is you're being robbed of, you're being alienated from, and so that's a way of talking about the abstraction in a way that's a little bit more, solid for, you try have to just simply imagine that, Marx is talking to trade unionists, workers, proletarians, and trying to explain, well, ultimately things get, messy, things get divided, things get accumulated. Some people have more stuff than other people, and that's where all the, kind of turmoil and crisis is, because not everything, what is it that you need, or what is sustainable, as opposed to something beyond sustenance, things that you accumulate. So that's where the kind of underlying question, why Marx found it useful to be able to talk in these kind of relatively uh, simple terms, because he had an audience that he was trying to talk to and say, this is what happens. This is what goes on in your workplace. This is how you're being quote unquote exploited. Um, and it does have a moral question built into it, certainly. So, needless to say, there are ways of talking about it. Quantum of living labor exerted in the economy be represented by money. So the melt is merely the expression of the stock of paper money that remains after outlays of constant capital divided by the total labor in the economy. Now, even that sounds complicated because it's kind of made into this mathematical expression, but there is some relationship, and let's just sort of leave it that way, that money, as commodity money, as a commodity, represents these other things, or represents an abstract thing that needs to be discussed. And it isn't that difficult to talk about, effort, to talk about work in that particular context. And so one shouldn't get very upset about this idea that people, trade the possibility of their labor, as in terms of labor power, as a function, an easier function of time. But we all know that it's not always identical. It's just not always identical. That time seems to disappear or to be compressed. For example, we can be amazed by so-called large language model uh, kind of cogitation, or and you don't really want to call it intelligence, but artificial intelligence, because it operates quickly and efficiently. Not necessarily that it's accurate, but that it has a certain degree of efficiency and speed that it mimics. And this is where the cognitive problem is. Is it identical to thinking, or it's obviously not sentient, but it gives you the illusion of this kind of completeness that is problematic. So, needless to say, you can analyze this as described here. Quantum of living labor exerted in the economy be represented by money. This is where, the discussion of commodity money and et cetera come from. It's important, of course, to note that this is melt is merely the expression of the stock of paper money that remains after outlays of constant capital divided by the total labor expended in the economy. So it's a simple ratio of those things. And so to reduce it, it's P times Q over L, and ultimately it's P times Q. That Now, what comes from this, and this is a very simple way of thinking about it, how we get to value, noting, of course, that there are, in the Marxist terms, um, use value and exchange values. And Marx develops this idea because it's important to consider the difference between things that we would do at scale for ourselves, if you're thinking about families, as opposed to things that you do within the context of, society, of social relations, exchanges, market. Um, and how is it that we get there? Well, this is a oversimplified way, but you can begin to talk about what counts as a unit value, which is not the same as time or money. It is a way of thinking about it that is this idea of V, that you can begin to think in, as it were, unitary terms. And most of the new research, I would assert, describes ways in which you can dynamically talk about this at scale. That we're dealing with large amounts, there's big data, there's all this sort of stuff. And explaining this stuff is really not very problematic. You just have to understand that there are a system of abstractions. They overlap or integrate or interdependent, and that they need to be either measured, accumulated, and formed in a variety of ways. System of forms. Now, not like there are palpable forms, but they are more like, in the Platonic sense, kind of consciousness, a kind of an awareness of something called form, which is why there's entire literature for quote unquote value form, which probably overindulges this notion that we're talking about here, is this idea of thinking in a unitary way about value. So anyway, and yes, we can think about it as also periodic, and so there's overvalued in exchange, less value per good than the global average, and undervalued. You see, overvalued and undervalued in exchange. Remember, we just talked about use value and exchange value. More value per good than the global average. And the point in all of this is the idea that you can have global averages. Now, that goes to the issue of what is global in that particular context. What is this larger value thing that you have to sort of work through, which is, and you could describe it as, I think you can, or I think that's the way it's sort of formulated, that the Capitalocene, as opposed to the Anthropocene, describes exactly this value and accumulation thing, which makes it a worthy concept, even though it's kind of a clunky neologism. But there is something that creates value that affects humans and their effect on the planet. And so, or if you were thinking in terms of geological history, for example, so that's why we would use Anthropocene and Capitalocene and etc., Plasticine, etc. So this idea of global averages sort of comes from this generalized notion, and don't worry about the algebra. The point is that a money expression of labor time is sort of a way in which you can talk about it without getting down to specific dollar figures or time elements. You can think structurally about these things, that this is a way of talking about total things. And that's kind of, to get all the way back to the front end of this, is what Moseley is talking about when Moseley talks about totality. because it's not quite the same as other totalities. And in fact, that's worth talking about too, is the difference in quote unquote totalizing discourse, how we would talk about these, things that bring stuff together, that aggregate other things. So that's to kind of give you an overview and not get you lost in the algebra that inevitably comes from discussing these things. And just one should not worry so much about it. But there will be algebra. So the monetary expression of labor time, i.e. the melt, is a key variable in Marx's theory and has played a prominent role in two important reinterpretations of Marx's theory. That is, the new interpretation, and new is just simply a notion that occurs in the latter quarter of the latter tenth, as it were, of the 20th century, that you might call a quote unquote new interpretation. And this sort of fits in with certain elements of post war Marxism, that and they are a kind of side product, and I don't know if you want to talk it that way, about sort of the new readings of Marx that occur in the 60s and 70s. And there is, not that it creates it, but it creates an environment in which the new interpretation becomes important. And then, as a function of that, or in relation to that, or as a development of that, or reaction to that, the temporal single system interpretation, the TSSI. Now, this paper first reviews Moseley's interpretation of the melt, that is, the monetary expression of labor time, as explicated by Moseley in 2011, and then critically examines in successive sections the interpretation of the melt presented by the NI and the TSSI. And sort of a final section summarizes the main conclusions. So there's algebra that's coming up, and a little math, and you should not get too crazy about it if you're not, that's not a deal. You'll note that there are key expressions here, and all of these things are in here. That is the labor theory of value, micro and macro economic elements, and sort of obviously Marx, and then of course money. So Moseley's interpretation of the melt. I argue that the basic logical framework of Marxist theory is the circuit. Remember, I talked about circuits before. Circuit of money capital, which is expressed symbolically by the familiar formula C dash prime dot 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 P dot 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 C C prime M dash C dot 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 P dot 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 C prime dash M prime, where M prime equals, M plus a delta M, which is, what profit is. So there's a profit idea built into this that comes from this. And recall that we looked at that little simple circuit, and that we get M, but we also get M prime at the same time. So there is a currency, as it were, and then there's something beyond currency, which is not the way you talk about gold, for example. You don't get new gold is problematic. You just don't get a lot of new gold. I mean, you can go out and try and dig for it and search around for it, but that's really a kind of fool's errand, so to speak. Which is why, to mention gold, on the one hand, Marx wanted to talk about it, and there's a variety of interpretations that talk about the question of why Marx emphasized gold. As he did it because it's kind of a simple concept, and as I said, simple concepts are important for kind of the audience messaging of things like capital, and it's not simply a pragmatic or expedient sort of reason for using gold, but you do sort of need to appreciate that gold was, in Marx, gold was only one step of talking about stuff. Then yes, it's in volume 1, but it doesn't mean that, you're talking, by the time you get to volume 3, you're not talking about gold anymore. And that's where the current set of issues is. That is, as we've been looking before, the differences among Volume 3, or things that address Volume 3, as in Anwar Sheikh and a bunch of other folks who were talking about, oh, so this is kind of what Marx meant in Volume 3, and then you kind of working through that, and as we looked before, noting that Volume 3 represents a certain period wherein things like the Grundrisse are written, that is when Marx is thinking about this, is trying to sort of work through this, and that Volume 3 represents that kind of set of differences that Marx begins to develop from a theory. And ultimately, theories of surplus value have some historical relationship to trying to describe the nature of how value is not only being created, but it's also being, as it were, accumulated as capital. So that's a whole nother set of questions. So anyway, the circuit of money capital captures the essence of capitalism and focuses Marx's theory on the most important question in a theory of capitalism. That is, where does the delta M come from? That is, this incremental increase come from? Where does profit come from? And what determines its magnitude? Surplus value is defined as delta M. Now, it's not as simple as that, but Moseley's trying to make it simple. And so delta M, the change, delta M, well, anyway, the increment of money capital that emerges at the end of the circuit, remember CMC, right, or MCM, there is a circuit of money capital. And, this is the increment of money capital, delta M, the thing that you add onto M that becomes, M prime. The circuit of money capital is not just a minor illustration in Chapter 4 of Volume 1 that plays no significant role in the rest of Marx's theory. Instead, the circuit of money capital is the basic logical framework for all of Marx's theory of the production and distribution of surplus value in all 3 volumes of Capital. The point here, of course, is that, as I just said, we tend to think in terms of Volume 1, but really you need all 3 volumes to get this sort of to work through. And noting, of course, that it was always incomplete and fragmented. It's not a complete set of ideas, even though Engels, cobbles it together. There is coherence, but it sits in a funny relationship that is, as Bellamy, if you could use Bellamy Foster as an example, you can see how, in terms of describing Marx on ecology, is that, and particularly since it's rooted in Engels and dialectics of nature, et cetera, you can see that what's going on there in trying to, put all 3 volumes together and trying to get it to make sense. And Engels is working at a time when science is also science in general, or more science specific, as it were, in England, is trying to, become more available and is working through some obviously interesting problems at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. I don't subscribe to zeitgeist things, but it really is a set of ideas trying to deal with this thing that, in the humanist context, you might call modernity, whatever that means. But you can see that a lot of things are happening kind of in tandem, as it were. So a brief algebraic summary of Marx's theory of value and surplus value is necessary in order to clarify the role of the melt in Marx's theory. For a more complete exposition of Moseley's macro-monetary interpretation of Marx's theory of surplus value, see Moseley 2016, which we're going to get to, especially chapters 1 and 2. Marx's theory, you see, that's why I chose this one little article, because it sort of says, okay, well, here's all the pieces you need to sort of put this thing together. Marx's theory of delta M, presented in Volume 1 of Capital, applies to the total delta M produced in the capitalist economy as a whole. Therefore, All of the variables discussed below are macroeconomic variables that refer to the capitalist economy as a whole. So automatically it's already restricted the argument. We're not talking about microeconomic variables. We're talking about macroeconomic variables. And yes, you could argue that there could be something called a super macro variable, which, sort of allows for the idea of, as Steve Keen would suggest, these larger scale structural dynamic issues that are that take the idea variable and work it out in a whole bunch of different directions, which is kind of the point, that it is a ultimately it's still it is at some level a quantum process, but you don't want to get too far afield and make yourself crazy too early. Let's say the magnitude of surplus value is by definition delta m equals delta prime minus m. So for any given period of production, for example, a year, the magnitude of surplus value is the difference between the total price of the commodities produced during the period P and the cost of producing these commodities K. Now, obviously, we're already thrown off here because there's a new letter, there's a new acronym. So S equals P, P minus K. The cost of commodities is the sum of two components: consumed constant capital, C, or C kind of 2, C superscript 2, and variable, well, that's the note that he's making, and variable capital. C, constant capital, consumed constant capital, C, and variable capital. So K, the cost of producing these commodities, is C, constant capital, plus variable capital. All, that's equation 2, or expression 2. I argue that constant capital and variable capital are taken as given in Marx's theory of surplus value as the actual quantities of money capital advanced to purchase means of production and labor power in the beginning. There's probably no actual beginning, but you sort of get the idea that at one moment, the starting moment, you could call it, the beginning of the circuit of money capital, and thus are equal to the price of production, of the means of production, and the means of subsistence, respectively. So there is a price associated, obviously, with production, but also something associated with this other thing that is part of, that ultimately is part of necessity or needs, and that is subsistence. But anyway, the total price of commodities produced in a year is also the sum of two components. Component 1 is the constant capital consumed in production, that is big C, capital C, which existed previously. And this idea of old value, there's something there before. This is why talking about the beginning, there is no beginning. There's something before, and there was old value. And it's taken as a given and transferred to the price of the output. And number 2, the new value in money terms that is produced by the labor of the current period. And note, of course, that labor is thrown in there on the one hand. On the other hand, and you sort of have to assume that something's going on, right? And labor of some kind is being expended in this process. But there's an entire set of arguments against this notion, or beyond this notion, that in financialization there's no equivalence to this. But that's just taking it probably over the line. Anyway. Line 3, or expression 3, is P equals C plus N. So labor of the current period N plus C, big C, constant capital consumed in production. Now, the new value component of the total price of commodities, N is the new value component of the total price of all commodities, is in turn. Now, let me look at the footnote here, because I think that's probably also important, that we shouldn't leave that behind. Please note that C, capital C, which stands for the consumed constant capital, 3 C's, depreciation cost of fixed constant capital plus circulating constant capital. So there's already accounting measures built into this. And so it's not just this one thing that is a capital, but rather it's much more fluid kind of idea. So it's not the same as the big C, capital C, which stands for commodities in the circuit of money capital. So already have confusion here. You can imagine the confusion that happens when you start talking about the algebra and you're using the same letter form. And, this is just, it makes a lot of people, just at a basic pedagogical level. So anyway, and yes, there is discussion beyond the scope of this paper. And yes, one needs to look at, Moseley's big works to sort of work through this, which we will be doing. So anyway, the new value component of the total price of commodities, N, capital N, is in turn determined by the product of the quantity of the total current socially necessary labor time employed. That is big L, capital L. That is in terms of abstract labor hours. So already you've got to remember that we talked before about units being an abstraction. Now we're also talking about abstract labor hours, which is probably this is an abstraction of an abstraction. I mean, just configuring the notion of a unit is problematic, but yet that's the fundamental problem for a lot of social sciences is the notion of what counts as a unit of anything, units of measure. So, and without getting into the other complications, and the money new value produced per hour of abstract labor, lowercase m. So, expression 4 is N equals ML. Equation 4 is the key assumption of Marx's labor theory of value. That is, that the money new value, big N, produced in the current period in the economy as a whole is proportional to the total quantity of socially necessary labor time, big L, employed during this period, with the money value produced per hour, M, as the factor of proportionality. So there's a lot, put together in a single expression of capital N equals lowercase m times L, big L. Thus, the money value produced per hour of abstract labor is a key variable in Marx's theory of value and surplus value. The money value produced per hour of abstract labor, see, already it's, kind of epiphenomenal, is a key variable in Marx's theory of theory of value and surplus value. In Marx's numerical example in the exposition of his basic labor theory of surplus value in chapter 7 of volume 1, the money value produced per hour is assumed to be 0.5 shillings per hour, so that a 6-hour working day produces 3, these are all abstractions, right? To get the math to work out. 3 shillings of money value, and a 12-hour day produced 6 shillings of money value. And we won't go into the long tedium of why this is, and they could be anything. I mean, relative to shillings or pounds or whatever. So Marx did not give a name to this key variable. Duncan Foley was the first to name this variable the MELT, the monetary expression of labor time, abbreviated as MELT. This is, Duncan Foley in 1986. Unfortunately, the word expression does not clearly connote production and the production of money value by living labor. So, already Moseley's got an issue, a semantic issue here, and we sort of should go along with the thing here, even though we may have to sort of correct it further on. I think a better name would be, as already stated, money value produced per hour of abstract labor. But, MVPHAL, MIPHAL, does not pronounce easily. So already you see this is, acronyms, you just got to lighten up, just relax, That money value produced per hour of abstract labor is what he means by talking about melt. But so I will continue to use the term melt to refer to this key variable. So you have to remember that melt is not one thing, but rather it is something produced per hour of something else. So there's a lot of things going on in this very simple expression. Substituting equation 4 into equation 3, we obtain, to combine them together. This is a linear, thing. P equals C plus ML, lowercase m and L. And substituting equations 2 and 5 into equation 1, we obtain, and yes, this is where it gets, it gets a little crazy. S equals P minus K, S equals bracket C plus ML bracket minus bracket C plus V bracket. So we can see that the given consumed constant capital, big C, capital C, is a component of both the price and the cost price of commodities, right? And thus, constant capital cancels out in the determination of the surplus value. That is why this component of capital is called constant. And equation 6 simplifies to S equals ML minus V. Therefore, according to Marx's theory, and this is probably where this is most important, don't worry about the algebra. Therefore, according to Marx's theory, the quantity of surplus value is determined by the difference. Remember, I talked about differences before, is the difference between the new value produced by workers and the variable capital that they are paid. So this is like a microcircuit, right? That is, workers are producing value, but they get, they're getting something for it. Wages are somewhere involved here, and the variable capital they're paid. Then the next step is to divide the average working day into two parts. That is necessary labor time, NL, capital N, capital L, and surplus labor time, capital S, capital L. Necessary labor time is defined as the number of hours of socially necessary labor time required for workers to produce money, that is new value, that is equal to the average variable capital that is paid to workers per day, i.e., NL equals V over small m. The remainder of the working day is surplus labor time, capital SL, equals L minus NL, i.e., the labor time in which the money new value produced by workers each hour, no longer goes to reproduce an equivalent of the variable capital pays to workers, but instead becomes a surplus value of capitalists. So this is just moment which something extra is being made, and this is the difference between, remember, if in talking about the difference between relative and abstract labor, in Marx, that it's important to think about this as, something else is being created, and it seems like it doesn't, it's hard to get a handle on. And you can imagine Marx trying to explain this to workers, that something's being taken from you and you don't see it. It's really hard to imagine it, but yet you have to imagine it, and it's being taken from you. You can just imagine the problem, that you're trying to, do this in multiple languages and talk to people who, don't necessarily have a lot of understanding of why these things work. They only know that they come in and that some people get, make more money than they do for some reason. So, anyway, i.e., the labor time in which the money new value produced by workers each hour no longer goes to reproduce an equivalent of the variable capital paid to workers. That is, there's like kind of an even trade of value, but instead becomes a surplus value of capitalists. In Marx's example in Chapter 7, variable capital equals 3 shillings, and M equals 0.5 shillings per hour. So NL equals 3SH, 3 shillings, over 0.5 shillings per hour, which equals, behold, 6 hours. So that we can see another key role for the melt in Marx's theory is to determine, in part, the division of the working day into necessary labor and social and surplus labor. Now, substituting these definitions of NL and SL into equation 7, we obtain capital S equals lowercase m times L, big L, minus V. And I won't go through this whole thing, but suffice to say, we get down to a variety of equivalences here in terms of moving M and SL and equivalents and whatever. You do lots of substitutions. This then, all these expressions, this then is Marx's surplus labor theory of surplus value delta M. So in algebra, you can get this thing. It explains, now this is the important part, it explains the total annual surplus value produced in the capitalist economy as a whole, and it concludes that the total surplus value is proportional to the total amount of surplus labor time of workers, with the melt as the factor of proportionality. So this is trying to, make sense of all this, that, how is it that we can explain this thing we can't, this thing we don't have a good handle on? How is it that we can explain it, and yet it's being stolen from you? Each hour of surplus labor produces lowercase m amount of money surplus value. So the next question is, as Moseley points out, what determines the melt? This key variable in Marx's theory of value and surplus value is clearer from equation 4. Well, it may not be clear from equation 4 above, that in order to be a determinant of money new value, the melt itself must be determined independently of money new value. So already we have a kind of abstraction that's another abstraction. Otherwise, there would be circular reasoning. So what he's trying to get to this point where, the extra stuff is the extra stuff. Well, it's not just that. And in fact, and if you wanted to argue in a slightly different, more conceptual way, there's nothing. Well, this would be the critique that I would render, is that sometimes circular reasoning has a certain kind of logic that is not, sort of annihilating, or it doesn't cancel itself out. Some people circular reason because, they need to circular reason, not unlike an economy. But anyway, the answer to this important question is different in different monetary regimes. That is, and there are different monetary regimes, and they do exist, and you can actually see them. Monetary commodity money, inconvertible fiat money, and inconvertible credit money. You can already see that there's capital, there's currency differences, there's money differences. The remainder of this section briefly reviews my interpretation of the determination of the melt in these three monetary regimes. In the case of commodity money, which Marx assumed throughout Capital, the book Capital, Marx's melt is determined by the value of the money commodity, i.e. gold, and is equal to the inverse of the value of a unit of gold, L sub G, or the quantity of gold produced per hour of labor. There's a lot there. And, anyway, the money value produced per hour of labor in all industries is equated with the quantity of gold produced per hour of labor in the gold industry. In Marx's Chapter 7 example, the value of gold is assumed to be 2 hours per shilling, and thus the melt the money expression of labor time is 0.5 shilling per hour. So algebraically, and yes, we'll make ourselves crazier again, is melt equals 1 over big L sub G sub G. In the case of inconvertible fiat money, the government forces into circulation paper money that is not convertible into gold. And it's not just the government doing this, but the government is a clear agent in this problem, particularly in the 19th century. Anyway, Marx discussed inconvertible fiat money in 3 different texts, and he argued that in this case, the melt depends not only on the value of gold, L sub G, but also on the ratio between the quantity of fiat money forced into circulation, MI, and the quantity of gold money, M sub G, that would be required if commodities sold at gold prices. So there's a lot to be discussed here, and you could argue, just in this one sentence, is the whole issue of people who are gold bugs. But anyway, expression 10, melt equals, bracket 1 over 1, 1 over LG, bracket operationally MT over MG. So, for example, if twice as much paper money were forced into circulation as required for circulation on the basis of gold prices, MI over MG asterisk equals 2, then the melt would double, and hence the prices of all commodities would also double. I showed in my 2011 paper, that is Moseley, 2011, that since the melt in this case is the product of 2 ratios, and L sub G is the denominator of one ratio and the numerator of the other, LG cancels out in their product, that is the melt, and equation 10 reduces to melt. This expression, where V is, now there's a new idea here, but if you put all those other things that we saw above together, something called V, the velocity of money, and L is the total quantity of current abstract labor employed that must be represented as money in the economy as a whole. So, thus, we can see that in the case of inconvertible fiat money, the melt does not ultimately depend on the value of gold, but instead depends on the ratio of the total quantity of money in circulation adjusted for velocity and the total current labor time that must be represented as money. So already you have a new idea here, and this is where econophysics comes in, money velocity. And there's just other problems in thinking about that, but you can already see these compressing a lot of stuff here. So we can also see that in the case of inconvertible fiat money, Marx's theory is similar to the quantity theory of money. See, this is ultimately where we get to. And the quantity theory of money is a big deal for other folks, in the sense that the quantity of money is independent of prices and determines prices in part. However, Marx's theory is also clearly superior to the quantity theory of money in the sense that Marx's theory also explains a wide range of important phenomena of capitalist economies, including, and the quantity theory does not explain these phenomena, the total profit produced in the economy as a whole, pervasive conflicts between capitalists and workers over wages and the length of the working day and the intensity of labor, endogenous technological change, trend and cycles in the rate of profit, and endogenous recurring crises. So there's a whole bunch there that comes with sort of not fully explaining all this stuff, and noting that and Marx isn't necessarily talking about this, but you can extrapolate from this that one of the other issues relative to money discussions is this question of, and particularly in a quantity theory of money, velocity. The quantity theory is a very narrow theory that explains at best only the aggregate. So you can see there's, aggregate price level, and does not explain any of these important phenomena. The point, of course, is that there's a lot of other things going on here, and having a quantity theory of money that excludes talking about crisis and endogenous things and blah, 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 doesn't really fully give you the story. It's not fully explanatory. Please note that V, the velocity in money in this equation, is different. Well, obviously, it's velocity. It's not variable capital. But this is that problem again with the algebra. In reality, there's a footnote 7. In reality, part of the fiat money forced into circulation is used to purchase financial assets rather than currently produced commodities. So this is the thing we begin to start worrying about is, that there are differences among capital, merchant capital, industrial capital, merchant capital, financial capital. So the stuff's happening, and it's symptomatic of this. The money used to purchase financial assets is deducted from the gross quantity of fiat money to determine the net quantity of money used to purchase commodities, and this net quantity of money is related to the current labor employed in the determination of the amount. Similarly, if part of the fiat money is hoarded, this is Scrooge McDuck, right? Hoarded instead of used to purchase commodities, a similar deduction would be made to determine the net quantity of money and the melt. So you can already see that there's something implied by, on the one hand, creating a summary commentary on the quantity of money and what it really represents. Marx did not discuss the case of modern inconvertible credit money. In Moseley's 2011 paper, he argues that in this case, the melt is determined in the same way as in Marx's case of inconvertible fiat money. And there you have expression 11. I will not repeat that argument here, thank God, but will just note that Marx's theory in this case is also similar to the quantity theory of money, but also has vastly greater explanatory power for the reasons listed above. That's what what he argues about, endogenous this and crises and blah, blah, blah. And the problem, of course, in all of these is that there's always this kind of abstraction and also simplification, and it is in a different way, totalizing discourse for different mathematical reasons. So the next two sections will discuss, in turn, the interpretations to the melt. See, finally, we get to where he needs to go, and that is he wants to separate out or articulate the differences between new interpretation melt and TSSI melt. So the section 2 is on. I see that I've run over time, and maybe I will complete discussing this. Anyway, there is a new interpretation, the ani of melt, and then this is exactly where we're now into accounting issues about value added, etc., and periodicity and stuff, and that all those are important. So this is the contributions of people like de Menil and Foley, Duncan Foley. Duncan Foley was the first to introduce the term monetary expression of labor time into the Marxian literature as part of his new interpretation of Marx's theory. See footnote 9. Although Foley originally defined the melt as the money value produced per hour of abstract labor, he has emphasized more an aggregate definition of the melt, namely because the numbers get a little nuts. The ratio of the total value added as a component of the total price to the total living labor employed in the current period. So, um, footnote 9 describes the difference between Foley's version and de Menil's version, de Menil, and thus there's no need for the melt, which is a factor of proportionality between labor time and money value produced. Anyway, expression 12. It's obvious that if the melt is determined in this way, then the melt cannot be used to determine value added. That would be circular reasoning. Now, value added cannot be taken as given in order to determine value added. Yeah. And since this definition of the melt cannot be used to determine value added, it can VA, it can also cannot be used to determine surplus value, and the NI is left without a rigorous theory of surplus value. So, there is this thing that, well, I think that there's ways of getting out of this, and he describes it further on, and I guess we'll take this up next time since I've already exceeded my time on this. Let me skip ahead. And yes, there's all kinds of stuff going on here. But let's look to the conclusion. You can read this at your leisure. The point in describing these two ideas, the new interpretation and the TSSI, the NI and the TSSI, is that, and I would assert that the TSSI is a simplification, a necessary one from a math point of view, that is necessary to explain all of this stuff, and with all due respect, is not that different from some of the simplifying elements that are partially mathematical of the neoclassical economics. It's just that it's not identical. It's just there's a structural similarity about the need, in a linear way, that linearity in the neoclassical model is, I'm not going to assert that they're similar enough or that they are identical. They're certainly not identical, but that there's a structural or familial similarity between the TSSI version, that is the temporal single system interpretation, and the kind of linear versions that exist in neoclassical economics. So anyway, let's get to the conclusion. The melt is obviously an essential variable in Marx's labor theory of value, which has to do with the production of money new value by living labor. It's really what we're talking about here, that people are working, and you need to sort of account for this, what's being made, by living labor. And they specifies the quantity of money new value produced per hour of abstract labor, the MVPHAL, which he doesn't want to use. This hourly rate of the production of new value is multiplied by the number of abstract labor hours in the current period in order to determine the total money new value produced in the current period. We saw this before. Capital N equals M times L. In order to determine the money new value in this way, the melt itself must be determined independently of money new value. The melt is clearly determined independently of money new value in the monetary regime of commodity money, and is equal to the quantity of the money commodity, that is gold, produced in 1 hour. This is, chapter 1 of, volume 1 of Capital. And logically, the melt must continue to be determined independently of money new value in today's monetary regime of inconvertible credit money. This paper has argued that both the new interpretation and the temporal single system interpretation have unsatisfactory interpretations of the melt, and for similar reasons. The NI, the new interpretation, defines the melt as the ratio value added to living labor, and thus the melt cannot be used to determine value added, which we just discussed. And the TSSI, which we haven't discussed, defines the melt as the ratio total price to labor, and thus the melt cannot be used to determine total price. So in both cases, the melt cannot be used to determine the quantity of surplus value produced, and thus, this is the point, this is the money shot, as it were, the NI and the TSSI are left without a rigorous theory of surplus value. In addition, both the NI and TSSI argue that Marx's theory of value and surplus value is not a one-way causal theory. It never has been, and unfortunately people reduced it to that. But anyway, is instead only a set of definitions or an algebraic identity in which the direction of causation, now this is the important point, between value added in LL or in TP and TL could go either way. Total labor and total, price. I argue that this is a misinterpretation of the Marxist theory of value, and surplus value was intended to be a one-way causal theory, and specifically and most importantly, that the money new value produced in a given period is assumed to be determined by the product of the melt and the quantity of labor employed, as in Marx's example in Chapter 7 of Volume 1, discussed above. Money new value is not assumed and then used, along with the melt, to determine the quantity of labor employed. That would be a very uninteresting and inconsequential theory, and no theory at all of value added or total price, and thus no theory of surplus value. So, in 2011, Moseley tries to advance our understanding of the determination of the melt independently of money new value in today's monetary regime of inconvertible credit money, as summarized above. I think that this paper is, quote unquote, on the right track, and that the melt, in this case, the money expression of labor time, melt, in this case, is determined by the relation between the quantity of money in circulation and the quantity of labor employed in production. But I don't think this is the final word. But it is an interesting research point. Further topics that remain to be examined, and this is the other thing, include, number one, the separation of the total money supply into money used to purchase currently produced commodities and money used to purchase financial assets. See, already there is a question, and an important question, of, what happens to money in financial transactions? He's already sort of trying to say, well, we got to research other stuff, and some of this other stuff is actually really important. Number two, the endogenous determinants of the quantity of inconvertible credit money in commodity circulation. And number three, the determinants of the velocity of money. I welcome comments, criticism, and suggestions on this paper and on these topics. So there's a whole bunch of other stuff that he's doing a little short thing, and it's a kind of perceived for, the big volume that we're going to look at, hopefully. But hopefully this whets a kind of appetite, as it were, for this. I urge you to look at this other attempt to simplify the melt, and I included some of the slides from that for those who came in late, for those things, and one should try and hopefully think about these differences. So anyway, that gets us to the end of our little session here today, and I hope I haven't lost you. I hope I've given you an interest, a curiosity about why Moseley is doing this, and he's doing it for an important reason. He's trying to account for money, as it always has been in the problem in Marx relative to labor, and for good reason, because the topic itself is sort of under attended to in the context of these interpretations, and in fact underpins some of the issues. We're still looking for certain things that are important across the board. Whether they become interesting as aggregates or average is a different question, but the point of trying to consider abstractions which accommodate certain other kinds of issues, which is what the discrediting of the labor theory of value has, sort of boiled down to, and which is addressed. It's addressed in a whole bunch of different literatures, and Sheikh approaches this problem in a slightly different, certainly a slightly different way, but it is this question of that: why is this? How is this surplus being created, and how is it that we can measure it? And as I think you can see, that there are some problems that are kind of accounting measure problems, and ultimately the whole thing turns on where you're going to define this thing about value, and money allows us a way of talking about it that is uh, one could argue that it is less confusing. It's just simply adding a different shape to the argument, and one that is actually kind of necessary if you're trying to figure out the difference between those things that are labored on, and the difference between that and commodities, which is as much larger or more complex or more invisible thing. So anyway, all right. Well, anyway, I yacked enough, and I hope somebody got something out of this. I'm going to return to the meeting and shut the live stream. And thank you for your attention.